On this channel, I've previously made a video covering the wild life story of Vyacheslav Datsyk titled MMA's Biggest Psychopath. But after learning about the story of today's video subject, I think you could make the argument that we found an even crazier Russian with a wilder backstory. Maxim Novosolev, or Mad Max as he's been nicknamed, is a convicted murderer who actually managed to build his MMA career after serving time in prison for murder. At the time of recording, he is currently back behind bars for a serious crime, and his backstory is littered with wild moments like wrestling with bears and becoming a YouTube star while behind bars, with Mad Max somehow forging a career as a Russian MMA cult hero despite his background as a serious criminal and convicted murderer. This video covers the story of one of Russian MMA's craziest characters, from his brutal upbringing to the present day where he is serving time in one of Russia's infamous penal colonies. Let's get into the video. The story of Maxim Novosolev began on May 15th, 1973, where he was born to a working-class family in the small city of Tretgorny. Tretgorny was a unique place to grow up in because it was one of Russia's closed towns, with a plant producing nuclear weapons located in the small city, meaning that anyone who wished to visit had to gain prior authorization from authorities. While that may seem interesting, actually living there as a kid was a different story, with Novosolev recounting that it was a fairly boring place to grow up, describing Tretgorny as like its own planet, due to it being closed to most of the outside world. Tretgorny, like most Soviet cities, was divided into districts, and the kids from each district would gang up together and go and fight other kids from other districts every weekend, with the fighting described at this stage as not very serious or particularly dangerous. But this environment of constant fighting would be the impetus for Novosolev to begin training in martial arts, heading to a local sambo gym to gain confidence, and he hoped to become one of the toughest boys in the city. Novosolev would keep training martial arts throughout his teenage years, and as he approached adulthood, he decided to gear his training towards a future career in the military, with conscription on the horizon. And in 1991, Novosolev was conscripted into the Russian army as planned, and he became a member of the Russian Airborne Forces, being trained in combat by grizzled veterans who had fought in Vietnam and Afghanistan. But after 2 years, Novosolev had served his time and he decided to exit the army, with a brief period as a military instructor before he returned to his hometown of Tretgorny with a massive problem. How was he going to earn good money while living in such a dead place? With limited options, Novosolev would decide to utilize the fighting skills he had developed across the streets, martial art gyms, and military, with the frankly massive Mad Max taking part in brutal underground, Fight Club-esque no-rules fights. These fights were often funded by organized crime bosses and were held at abandoned locations well away from police, with no referee to jump in and save someone once they'd had enough. With MMA not really existing at the organized level that it would eventually arrive at, this was the only real chance for someone like Novosolev to monetize his fighting skills, but it came with immense risk. In an interview, Novosolev has described seeing the loser of these fights often taken straight to intensive care as a result of the beating that they had received, with it rumored that those unfortunate enough to die from their injuries would just be buried in a quarry and quickly forgotten about. Not exactly sure if that's true, but it's 1990s Russia, so who honestly knows. These fights were extremely dangerous, but could also be fairly lucrative, with Novosolev purchasing his first ever car with proceeds earned from winning a no-rules fighting tournament. But while these fights could pay well, they were unreliable and ultimately not lucrative enough to sustain someone completely, and Novosolev was forced to try and find another avenue to make money. But instead of getting a job at a supermarket, Novosolev would of course decide to venture deeper into criminality. Because let's be real, if he decided to go work in a supermarket, I probably wouldn't be making a video on him. Given that Novosolev was absolutely massive and trained in both shooting and fighting, it wasn't hard to see where he might fit in the criminal underworld, and he began participating in robberies and collecting drug debts. But this line of work quickly escalated and would have deadly consequences pretty fast. Novosolev became embroiled in a brutal gang war, with this war culminating in a scene directly out of a badly made Steven Seagal film, when Novosolev was confronted by members of a rival gang while in an abandoned warehouse. Tensions boiled over quickly, with one of the rival gang members reaching inside a bag for a machine gun, but Novosolov was able to wrestle the gun away from him, and he did not hesitate in spraying bullets, killing the man who'd reached for the gun and hitting several others. In this wild shootout, 2 men would die, with Mad Max responsible for the first killing, and 2 other men were badly injured after being shot. 1990s Russia was absolutely crazy. Unsurprisingly, this shootout would have serious legal ramifications for Novosolov, with police arresting him and charging him with murder, and the judge passing down a sentence of 14 years. A sobering reminder of the outcome that is often provided by a life of crime. With this sentence to be served in one of Russia's harsh penal colonies, it seemed like a pretty grim outcome. But Novosolov would come to appreciate this lengthy period behind bars, as life in the underworld moved on without him, and he managed to avoid the continued bloodshed that went on in the streets, with most of the friends that he'd made on the outside dying while Novosolov was serving his time. If he'd have not been locked up, it was very likely that he would have ended up just like them. While serving his time in prison, Novosolov was up to his old tricks and began participating in scheduled fights against other inmates behind the guards' backs, with the reward for winning these fights coming in the form of cigarettes, tracksuits, and third-line boots, rather than the cold hard cash that he'd collected when fighting on the outside. These prison fights were again noteworthy for their brutality, with no stoppage until the opponent had completely stopped moving, or other inmates took pity and dragged the winner off the loser when they felt that he'd had enough. Occasionally, the guards would bust this fighting, and this would result in Novosolov serving significant parts of his sentence in grim solitary conditions as a punishment. And his prison fighting antics also had the downside of putting a target on his back from other inmates who didn't like the level of savagery Mad Max would show in these fights. The threat from other inmates was real enough that Novosolov has recounted carrying a sharpened toothbrush around to use as a makeshift weapon, along with sleeping with fishing line tied up in his cell at night, so that any potential attacker might stumble on the fishing line and make enough noise to wake Novosolov up so he could defend himself. During Novosolov's trial for murder, the prosecutors had actually sought the death penalty, but the judge had disagreed with this and instead handed him his sentence of 14 years. And somehow, despite his extracurricular fighting activities behind bars, Novosolov would be released early from prison after serving just 10 years of his sentence for murder. It was time for the convicted murderer to try and write a new chapter in his life, and it just so happened that mixed martial arts was starting to come to prominence, offering a legitimate path for the fighting that had defined Novosolov's life to this point. Mad Max emerged from prison in 2003 to a very different world than the one that he had left behind 10 years earlier. Previously, the only way that he'd been able to monetize his fighting skill had been participating in savage underground fights funded by sketchy crime bosses in abandoned locations. But as MMA was beginning to pick up in popularity, there was a new, legal, and safer route for Novosolov to make money fighting, with his colourful backstory likely adding to the allure of seeing him fight. It would not take long after he was released before Novosolov would dip his feet into the MMA world, and just a week after his release, he was already competing in unofficial fights in gyms, putting a lifetime of experience to work in a more organised setting. In 2004, he would begin his formal fighting career and made his professional MMA debut as a late-notice replacement for an injured fighter. In fairness to Mad Max, his first opponent was no scrub, with Milko Vaughn holding a record of 8 wins and 1 loss. A very difficult ask for your debut, and Novosolov would come unstuck, lasting the full 2 rounds but losing via the scorecards to put his record at 0 wins and 1 defeat. All in all though, it wasn't a bad showing for a guy who'd been in prison for 10 years and had never fought professionally before, and it seemed that getting a taste of legitimate fighting left him wanting more, as Novosolov would decide to keep fighting, picking up his first win in August 2005 in a regional Russian promotion against a fighter with 8 wins and 8 losses. Mad Max then had a 3-year gap with no sanctioned fights, in which he did a bunch of random things. One of these was working as an instructor for private European military units, giving classes on fighting against weapons and applying combat sambo in a military context. It seems a bit weird that a convicted murderer and former gangster got this job, but this was the pre-internet time, so who really cares? However, according to Novosolov, this line of work would dry up when Austrian special forces decided to quit after their first training session because they felt it was too hard, with word being spread around Europe to avoid Novosolov and his colleagues. Whether this is true or not, I have no idea, but it is what Novosolov alleges. With his days as a military instructor over, Novosolov traveled to Japan and fought over there in MMA bouts that haven't been captured by record keepers, with his time in Japan apparently being where he earned the nickname Mad Max for his wild fighting style. Around this time, it was allegedly common for fighters to get stiffed out of their pay by shady promoters. But Novosolov, with his history of collecting debts from hardened criminals, did not have such problems with getting paid. Novosolov would also pursue combat sambo, where he would become European sambo champion in the over 100 kg category. Following his sambo success, Novosolov would return to MMA in 2008, but picked up a defeat against his least experienced opponent to date. No doubt a huge disappointment, which left his record at 1 win and 2 losses. But from this low point, his record would pick up considerably, with a huge win streak, though that doesn't mean that there weren't some roadblocks in the way as he put together win after win. Novosolov's fights had taken place in very low-level promotions, and pursuits like combat sambo were definitely not paying the bills. So once again, Novosolov was struggling to make ends meet, and he would make the exact same mistake as last time by deciding to solve this problem by delving further into crime. In 2012, after a couple of years with no recorded pro MMA fights, Novosolov's name was back in the news when it was revealed that he had been jailed for 3.5 years for, and I quote, patronizing the drug business. Every story that I can find on this translates it to that exact quote of patronizing the drug business, and I can't quite make out whether that refers to him being a user or a dealer. But an interview that he did would seem to hint that this conviction was for dealing. Either way, Novosolov had another 3.5 years in a penal colony to look forward to. But again, Mad Max would use this time behind bars relatively productively, somehow convincing the penal colony leadership to set up sporting facilities to allow inmates to train, with 40 prisoners training under Novosolov's leadership. I guess it takes balls from the guards that the thought of 40 highly trained men, led by a madman like Novosolov, didn't seem to really faze them. In fact, the reputation of Russian penal colonies as some brutal hellscape takes a serious blow when you realize that they even let YouTubers in to make videos covering these training sessions. I mean, it's not exactly Swedish prison conditions, but it's also not the Call of Duty gulag either. This footage from YouTube shows Novosolov teaching prisoners about knife and axe combat, among many other things, which I don't think I can show on here without getting demonetized due to the weapons. But the training looks broadly similar to what he would have delivered back in his military instructor days. These videos seemingly opened doors for Novosolov, as upon his release from prison, he would become something of a Russian MMA YouTube star. Russian MMA YouTube seems like an interesting place, with some channels that absolutely bang hundreds of thousands, if not millions of views, by making videos with people like Mad Max, or the subject of one of my other videos, Vyacheslav Datsyk. True Gym MMA, for example, had videos with Mad Max that have view counts that rival almost anything that any star in the UFC could generate. It's quite a unique corner of YouTube that I don't fully understand as I can't speak Russian, but it is interesting that relatively no-name fighters could be such huge stars on YouTube by virtue of their outside of the cage antics. Now that Mad Max was home from prison, he would regularly appear on these channels, often fighting in unofficial gimmick-type fights while also resuming his real MMA career. And this combination of income sources was probably the most money he'd ever consistently made from fighting in his life, while carrying a fraction of the risk of his previous underground fighting antics. When he made his comeback to professional fighting at the age of 42, Mad Max's record stood at 1 win, 2 losses, and a draw. But he would go on a winning streak from here, picking up win after win at low-level shows across Russia, with his YouTube notoriety helping to push ticket sales and secure him more fights. There was almost even a fight between the two Russian YouTube superstars, when a fight with none other than Vyacheslav Datsyk was booked, but this fight would fall through due to Datsyk going to prison. A fairly fitting conclusion to what would have been a big fight between two guys who have spent a lot of their lives in and out of jail. Novosolov's career on the regional scene was going well, but ultimately, considering his comeback began at the age of 42, it wasn't going anywhere particularly interesting due to a combination of his age and a criminal record that would put off any serious international promotion from signing him. But despite the lack of high-level fights, you have to give credit where it's due. Novosolev went on a 12-fight winning streak if you include his modified rules and boxing match. Albeit though, this win streak came against pretty terrible opposition. If you think I'm kind of glossing over his MMA exploits a bit, then I'll give you a random sample of his competition to show you why. In 2019, Mad Max, with a record of 7 wins, 2 losses and a draw, would face off against Alexander Alexic, a fighter making his MMA debut. Footage of this fight exists and bro, come on, just look at the size difference. It literally looks like he's fighting an accountant or something. To be fair, I don't think Novosolev had intentions of trying to make the UFC or anything crazy, and these fights may just seem more like glorified exhibitions. But yeah, let's not bother delving too deep into Mad Max's 12 wins and 2 losses fight career, given the level he was fighting at. What is more interesting is the crazy stuff he was doing on YouTube. YouTubers have never been afraid to do wild stuff for views, and Mad Max was no different, with there being multiple videos of him wrestling with bears, much like the famous video of a young Khabib. Novosolev was a YouTube demon, with a video of him in the octagon with 2 attack dogs, for example, doing over 2 million views. There's also hilarious videos of Novosolev going back to his unsanctioned fight days, with videos of gimmick fights like him versus 3 guys where he just absolutely batters them, with the first 2 guys deciding after the first few seconds that they'd had enough and giving up. Honestly, if he would have seen out his days doing his low-level pro fights and featuring in these YouTube videos on True Gym MMA, it would have been a fairly decent result for a guy who was convicted of murder just a few decades prior. But unfortunately, while to the Russian public it may have seemed like he'd turned his life around and become a productive member of society, another heinous crime was just around the corner, and it would land him in prison where he remains to this day. Mad Max's last professional fight came in January 2022, and the reason for 2 years with no fights is that he was arrested and charged with the rape of an 18-year-old girl. Novosolev and friends had allegedly met this girl at a nightclub, and Novosolev had offered her a ride home. This girl was then abducted by Novosolev, who would commit assault against her. Novosolev would plead not guilty to this and claimed that her story was all lies. He also tried to claim that he was spiked and he couldn't remember anything from that night, but the judge saw through this fairly poor excuse and convicted him, sentencing Novosolev to 5 years in prison and sending him back to a penal colony for the 3rd time in his life. A damning indictment on a man unable to turn his life around, despite the opportunities that he'd managed to forge for himself. This latest crime was a genuinely despicable act, for which he remains in prison to this day. When he is released in a couple of years, you would assume that his MMA career is finished, and he won't be getting featured by those big Russian MMA YouTube channels anymore. But then again, I genuinely wouldn't be shocked if he somehow manages to make a comeback. Maxim Novosolev's life appeared to be over when he was convicted of murder back in the 90s, but a relatively light sentence gave him a second chance at life, and he slowly but surely seemed to be climbing his way up to success, though not without a few bumps in the road along the way. But his latest conviction has completely ended any redemption arc, and has cemented his legacy as a deranged psychopath. There was an opportunity for this story to have a happy ending, but instead, the story of Maxim Novosolev ends in disgrace. The end. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed, then check out my video on the MMA fighter who lied his way into the UFC. Drop a like and subscribe for more videos just like this one, and check out my football and American football channels linked in the description if you enjoy those sports. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.